Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Jag heter Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Naleczinski. Jag måste tyvärr nämna att min ljudutrustning började haverera på allvar under inspelningen av det här avsnittet. Jag har gjort mitt bästa för att tvätta bort oljud från de värsta klippen så att ljudkvaliteten är varierande. Bättre ljudkvalitet utlovas i framtida avsnitt. Det här avsnittet ska handla om den italienske regissören Lucio Fulci och de surrealistiska, framförallt skräckfilmer som han var mest känd för. Jag vill tillägga att den här podcasten inte kommer i närheten av ett rättvist karriärsporträtt eller genomgång av Fulcis hela 56 långfilmer. Utan som vanligt så fokuserar jag på de filmer som jag själv tycker är intressanta. Men jag kommer såklart att gå igenom lite snabbt hans grejer som han är mest känd för de som inte känner till det. Jag har gjort lite research och lyssnat igenom några andra podcasts som behandlar Fulci och jag tror att den här podcasten faktiskt kommer att landa ganska högt. Det började så här. När jag gick i andra klass så snackade jag med en kille i min klass. Han hade en äldre bror som hyrde och swappade skräckfilm på VHS. Han berättade om en film som han hade sett som heter Huset vid kyrkogården. En helt ny film vid det tillfället. Och det groteska monstret i den som slaktade folk på olika sätt och åt upp liken. Det var liksom helt kört för mig att se den här filmen eller hyra den på VHS i butiken. Att hyra en VHS i butiken vid den tiden kostade hela 55 kronor. Det var ju alltså dyrare än att gå på bio. För på den tiden så var det fortfarande coolt att man kunde sitta hemma och kolla på film i sin egen soffa. Men skit i det nu. Den här historien om filmen lämnar mig inte och jag blev besatt av att se den här filmen. Det skulle dröja mer än 7 år tills jag slutligen fick tag i filmen. En evighet för en 8-åring. Men som tur var så visste jag inte hur länge det skulle dröja och märkligt nog så mindes jag min klasskompis darrande röst när han beskrev groteskerierna. Det visades ju en och annan skräckfilm någon gång om året på de 2 kanalerna så utbudet på tv på den tiden. Men ingen sån här skit. Enligt gemene man sunkiga, trötta filmer med fumliga monster och zombies som sliter ansiktet av en gubbe i slow motion i ett badkar fullt med skitigt vatten till slöa, brusiga syntmattor. Men det var just det som gjorde Lucio Fulcis filmer så originella som vi ska diskutera i det här avsnittet. Filmer gjorda av en komplicerad regissör i ett land under en tidsålder när den typen av film och excentriskt beteende fortfarande tolererades. Till min hjälp har jag 2 experter, Fulci-forskarna Stephen Thrower från London och Troy Howarth från Pennsylvania i USA. Stephen Thrower, experten på ämnet, berättar om en av de många anekdoterna om Fulci.
Fulci was a guy that didn't care much about his personal appearance. He was unpretentious to the point of crudity at times. Alan Jones told a story about Lucio walking to a location, smoking his pipe all the time, and walking to the location with the crew and taking a piss as he walks along the, not actually stopping but pissing as he walked along the path leading up to the location. So, it's just a very practical thing to do. You're busy, you don't have time to stop to go to the bushes. He was a rough diamond, shall we say.
Troy Howarth, författare till Fulci-boken Splintered Visions.
By most accounts, outwardly very crude. He was very foul-mouthed. He wasn't very concerned about his appearance. He was known as being rather a sloppy-looking man. As a matter of fact, a lot of people in Italy called him Lucio Fulci. Fulci apparently means fleas in Italian, P-U-L-C-I instead of F-U-L-C-I. So that was kind of a reference to the fact that he looked a bit disheveled and a bit sloppy. But in spite of that, he was an incredibly intelligent, very well-read, very articulate, and very, I think in a way, very sensitive man. So he had a tendency to test people. And I think he liked to see how far he could push them. And if they pushed back, he liked them. And he was very loyal to them. But if they just sort of folded over, he could be very aggressive and unpleasant towards them. And if he thought that they were getting by more on, let's say, if they were involved in a relationship with somebody or they were getting by on their looks or something, he could be very, very cruel.
Do you have an example of a situation like that?
Fulci was extremely aggravated with the actress Areta Gay, who was in Zombie. And she's the woman that very famously did the nude scuba dive scene, and she runs into the zombie underwater. And apparently she was one of those actresses who was hired more for her physical attributes than for her acting abilities. And Fulci apparently did not like that very much. And he apparently, according to Richard Johnson, got so angry with her at one point that he threw himself down on the ground, started rolling around and eating the grass. And Richard Johnson was watching this. Of course, Richard Johnson, very distinguished, very British, very deadpan, is watching this. And Fulci said, "If I don't eat of the grass, I'm going to eat of you," So that always amuses me, that story. And David Warbeck, he told a story one time about Fulci being so into what he was doing, directing a sequence. He was sitting on top of this camera crane, and the camera was doing a complicated movement, and Fulci was sitting on the crane and directing, and was so into what he was doing, he didn't realize that he was approaching a beam, a wooden beam on the ceiling. So at one point, they're doing the sequence, and they don't realize what's coming. And all of a sudden they hear this terrible "ow" coming from the background. It turns out that Fulci had smashed his head into the beam because he was so into directing this sequence.
Steven Thrower är mest känd för att ha skrivit den fantastiska Fulci-boken Beyond Terror. En av de absolut bästa, om den kanske inte den absolut bästa boken om Fulci. When did you first meet Lucio?
Getting it ready around the time that Fulci was in the UK to attend a film festival here, which was in the mid-1990s. He looked like a Canadian logger, a checked jacket that looks, like a workman's jacket almost, nothing at all pretentious or nothing at all he wasn't concerned about his visual image at all, For a man that had worked in the film industry as a director for 30, 40 years, he wasn't going to put on a suit and tie just to impress you, essentially. I met him there, and he was in a very, very good mood. He had lots and lots of people around him, and he was in very high spirits. And I said, I'd really like to come to Italy and spend a little time with you and actually do a very detailed interview. Would that be possible? And he said, yes, we will do that. And you must come to my house. And I live near Lake Bracciano, and we can walk by the lake and have a chat. And of course, this sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It sounds fantastic. You think, oh, well, this is going to be great. We're going to, actually going to spend some quality time. But when I actually arrived in Rome at the arranged time, I'd flown to Rome, and then when I rang him from the railway station to say, well, I'm getting the train, he said, no, I don't want to do it. I was obviously quite upset and quite angry, really, that he was sort of telling me to go away when I'd come all that distance, So I rang him back about 15 minutes later and said, I really don't, you can't do this. This is really unfair. Can we at least meet tomorrow or the day after? And he said, no. And he got very angry. He was prone to very erratic mood swings, and his health in latter years meant that he was more and more unpredictable in that sort of way. And sadly, the big career-long interview that I was going to use as the basis of the book didn't work out. Eventually, I talked him round to agreeing to an interview, but it wasn't a very long one. It was about 2 hours. I went to his house in this little, very, very beautiful village called Bracciano, and I sat and spoke to him. Extremely unreasonable, flew into a rage for very, very slightest provocation. He thawed and gradually started to get into the interview a little bit more, and but he was in a bad mood. Basically, he didn't really want to do it. He was, and I wasn't in a terribly good mood either, to be honest. It wasn't a successful interview. I did use a little bit of the information that I gleaned in the book, but it wasn't a sufficient interview to print as an interview in the book, so I ended up not doing that.
So what was the first film feast that you encountered?
I was in a cinema in Yorkshire, which is where I lived at the time. It's where I was brought up. And it was The Beyond. The Beyond utterly stunned me and amazed me, and I think I went back to see it that week in that cinema 3 more times, and then it would play in a neighbouring town, or the same print essentially was going from city to city. And I'd kind of follow it around and go and see it in other towns wherever it was playing. So I must have seen it about 12 times or something like that in the space of a year or something. So.
But what was it about his work that fascinated you so much?
I like the sense that there's an illogicality to the plotting and a sort of unpredictable quality. The whole appeal of the supernatural for Lucio, I think, was that it allowed him to become more surrealistic. When people die in the films, that it's not like just a knife attack or a bludgeon or gunshot or whatever. People die from having their faces eaten by tarantulas, or they die because a bottle of acid is kind of floats through the air and tips itself over a person's face. Totally unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen next in that movie.
Troy Howarth.
I definitely really like that surrealistic flair that's in his movies. Some scenes that come to mind are definitely like the dream sequences in A Lizard in a Woman's Skin. There's a sequence where the lead actress, Florinda Balkan, imagines that her family is sitting around the dinner table and they've all been eviscerated and they look like they're something out of a Francis Bacon painting. Their faces are very theatrically made up. There's innards spilling out from their stomachs. And she hears a sound of a bird from off screen, and she starts to run. And it's this obviously very animated shadow of a bird following her from above. It's extremely stylized. It's extremely unrealistic. It's meant to be unrealistic. And I think it has a great visual flair. It's really a stunning looking sequence. Well, the underwater sequence in Zombie is just amazing because of how audacious it is. I mean, name another movie where you have a zombie fighting a shark. That's incredible. First of all, that they were able to get that makeup to hold up underwater like that. I don't quite know how they managed to do that, but that's extraordinary. It's surreal because it is so unexpected. It's kind of like, it's basically the Italian exploitation cinema idea of, well, let's take something that's popular and put it together with something else that's popular. Everybody likes zombies. Everybody likes Jaws. Let's put it together and see what happens. And it's great. And it's not that it comes off like it's a ripoff, because it is completely unique. I love it because it is so completely out there. I mean, who else would have thought of something like that?
Well, the most famous Fulci films are, apart from Zombie 2, also known as Zombie Flesheaters, starring Mia Farrow's sister, Tisha Farrow, is his trilogy, City of the Living Dead, The Beyond, and House by the Cemetery, all three starring Catriona MacColl. These films have been covered so many times, I actually considered excluding them, but just to say a few words for those who doesn't know what I'm talking about. After George Romero's classic Dawn of the Dead was a hit, this needed to be exploited overseas, and Fulci got a zombie film script to direct. Dawn of the Dead was co-produced by Dario Argento and called Zombie in Italy, so naturally Fulci's movie was called Zombie 2, to cash in on its success. And even though Dawn of the Dead is a great and bloody zombie film, Fulci's film goes beyond madness as usual. It's set on a Caribbean island and features buried rotten corpses of conquistadors arising from the ground with worms crawling in their eyes. A zombie gets into an underwater fight with a shark and eats it. A woman is dragged slowly by her hair towards a broken door where a splinter slowly penetrates her eye. The zombie makeup and mood created by the wisps of fog at night and dirty, rotten, half-collapsed buildings is to this day unexcelled. The secret to why Fulci's films looked so good, even though most of them were B pictures, was that the technicians behind the camera wanted to keep working. So one month they could be working on a Fellini or Antonioni film, and the next doing a Zombie Flesheaters with Fulci. People call them B-movies today, but the brilliant scenography and mood created by expensive wind machines and smoke machines would be impossible to recreate today with the horror film budget standards. The Lovecraft trilogy starts with City of the Living Dead. In Lovecraft's town, Dunwich, the gates of hell are opened and the dead terrorize the living. Maggots rain from the sky, a girl vomits her entrails into her lap, and a guy gets a huge drill through his head. The soundtrack by Fabio Frizzi is brilliant as usual. City of the Living Dead, I've heard, had the least budget and the shooting schedule was extremely stressed.
All the films that were made at that time, I think Catriona MacColl said that she thought it was the shakiest one in terms of production, that it was a bit rushed and there wasn't as much time and it felt a little bit less stable as a production surrounding ones. But I'm not really aware of any specifics on what the production problems were.
Even on Blu-ray, the image is really grainy.
City of the Living Dead in particular is an extremely grainy movie. And I don't know if it was shot in 16 millimeter, but it was shot in some sort of a strange format and then blown up. And I think that accounts for all the extra grain in the film. I think that there is added clarity to the image, but with that added clarity, there's a lot more grain. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Next up was The Beyond, which is by far the best of the trilogy. Inspired by H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith stories. It starts out in the 1920s when a warlock is captured by a village lynch mob and whipped with chains, crucified on the wall, and has melted asphalt thrown in his face, just like his servants of Avon in Clark Ashton Smith's story, The Door to Saturn. In his home is also a very eerie and cool picture of a nightmarish landscape, which is apparently hell. There is too much funny silliness, absurdities and grotesqueries in this film to talk about everything here. But one thing mentioned by Fulci's daughter Antonella. By the way, I tried to get in touch with Antonella and get her on the show, but she just didn't answer my mess. She has been very nice before to me, and I guess she's just tired of talking about her father again and again. Well, in an interview, Antonella told the story that the mysterious sign in the Beyond, and also it returns in Fulci's fantasy film Conquest, that is in the forehead of the hero. The sign was invented by Antonella as a homemade tattoo, and she said that her father was so angry about this tattoo that he put it in the film as a punishment. And this is pretty funny, since the sign has a pretty unique look, and people have spread a rumor that the sign has turned up in ancient ceremonial buildings and magical tomes, and that Fulci was involved with black magic. So, that was funny. I asked Stephen if he knew who owned that picture of hell today.
I wish I did, and even more, I wish the picture still existed and one could try and buy it. But can you imagine? Somebody painted that. Probably some guy working in the props department, in the art design department of De Paula Studios, probably paid industry standard for creating that painting. No more than he would have got paid for painting the sets. That amazing, wonderful picture was created and then probably trashed, thrown away after the film. So certainly Lucio didn't have it.
Did you ask him about it?
Yes, I did, and he sort of like he had no idea where the picture was. You'd like to believe, wouldn't you, that he would have kept it at the end of the movie and said, well, that's coming home with me. It makes my heart bleed to imagine it being thrown away with all the other kind of unwanted set props and things at the end of the movie.
There was a story about homeless alcoholics being cast in the Beyond.
The casting for the bodies that are lying on the ground was conducted with vagrants, essentially, homeless people and alcoholics who were sort of hanging around a particular area of Rome, just not far away from the studios, who were invited to come in, for probably not very much money, enough money to buy a bottle of spirits, and left to lie, just lie down whilst they were made up and covered in this strange sort of soil and makeup and things. The decision to cast down and out alcoholics as the dead resulted in some unfortunate sort of friction with the actual cast, because I don't think they were terribly well behaved. I think perhaps there was a certain amount of inappropriate touching or inappropriate language, at least, directed at the cast from these probably rather heavily drunk individuals.
So they were cast as zombies?
Not the zombies, no. The zombies, they're performers who were in many, many movies. Some of those people had very, very long careers and had done 80, 100 films, but in tiny, tiny bit parts, never doing anything big. So it's a very strange career. You know, you're basically like a sort of a featured extra forever. I enjoyed the feeling a little bit like with the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, where Dunwich, the characters from one story kind of reside in the next town or the next village to the characters in another story. So I loved the feeling that it was suddenly like a world, like a universe was starting to open up. You know, like this kind of Lucio Fulci worldview was starting to develop. And of course, they're both very, very, very violent films as well. So if you're rather fond of movie violence, as I have always been, then the scene where a woman throws up her entire intestines, is going to impress you, and it impressed me very much at the time.
Well, there's a funny story about Clark Ashton Smith's story, The Door to Saturn and the Book of Eibon. In that story, it's about the powerful wizard Eibon and his magical tome called the Book of Eibon. And I'm absolutely sure that Fulci read that story, because in the film The Beyond, the villagers tortured the wizard, the disciple of Eibon, by crucifying him and throwing melted asphalt on his forehead. And in the story, exactly that happens to Eibon's disciples by an angry lynch mob. And as a side note, there's a funny thing that the story The Door to Saturn is probably Clark Ashton Smith's silliest story. It's absolutely like Philip Gillette described it as a crazy cartoon. So it's very funny that Lucio Fulci read this story and decided to make a somewhat serious film about it, The Beyond. Serious in the way that I mean that the things that are funny in The Beyond are unintentionally funny.
I suppose the important thing to say about that is that Dardano Sacchetti was the writer of that. Referentiality perhaps comes from Sacchetti. The particular morbid atmosphere and the darkness and melancholy of the films, I think, probably comes from Lucio. A man with a lot of rage and a lot of anger, but also there's a sadness there as well. And I think that combination of melancholy and violence, which is particular and unique, I think, to those films and to Fulci's films, and something that makes them very different to someone like Joe D'Amato or Umberto Lenzi.
Well, I don't know about Clark Ashton Smith, but we do know Fulci was a huge admirer of H.P. Lovecraft.
He talked about Lovecraft in interviews, and I do believe he was a reader of Lovecraft. So unfortunately, it became difficult to get to the bottom of his relationship with Dardano Sacchetti, because they fell out very badly. He had a huge row, and their friendship was over by the mid-1980s.
Do you know why Dardano and Fulci fell out? What happened?
It ended, unfortunately, because Fulci and Sacchetti were both extremely strong-willed people. Fulci and Sacchetti both had a tendency, when they gave interviews, I think, to want to take credit for everything. So I think there was a little bit of mutual hurt on both sides, that Sacchetti would say, "Oh, you like that scene in Zombie? Well, that's only because that's exactly the way I wrote it, and Fulci just filmed exactly what I wrote." Fulci would say in an interview that Sacchetti's contributions really weren't all that important. So it was kind of a mutual back and forth. You never get a straight answer from either of them, or maybe it's just their own version of the truth. Maybe it's unfair to say that it's being untruthful from either one of them. Maybe they both just happen to see it that way. They were both fans of fantastic literature. They were both very well read on the subject. Don't forget, Fulci started off as a screenwriter, so it wasn't as if he didn't know how to write a script or how to incorporate his own influences. I think they both brought that to it.
The House by the Cemetery is shot right after the success of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and although Fulci and the writers deny ever having seen or heard of that film, something I find rather hard to believe, it's pretty obvious the producers meant to cash in on that film's success. A little boy with psychic powers moves into his house with his parents. The little boy sees a ghost of a little girl that's long dead. and in the cellar lives the zombie of Dr. Freudstein, a turn-of-the-century physician in a pretty cool 1800 surgeon outfit. He has kept himself alive by consuming the flesh of the living. I'm not sure if he just eats them or if he actually magically attaches the flesh to himself, because he looks like he's been put together from different pieces of random flesh. Anyway, everybody dies except the little boy, who encounters the little ghost girl and her ghost mother, and together he's forced to walk with them down a lonely road, and we hear the cries of long-dead little children on the soundtrack. Do you have any stories concerning the production of The House by the Cemetery?
I mean, he was directing so many movies so close together that he didn't have a chance to finish one before he was starting to work on another. I mean, it was originally going to be called Freudstein or Freudstein, which some people may well know that's the name of the monster in the film. The film doesn't, thematically, it doesn't really deliver on the possible meanings of the word Freudstein, Freud and Frankenstein. There's a guy who worked there as the head of foreign sales called Michael Freudenstein, or Michel Freudenstein. Fulci had worked with Titanus before, so it's not impossible that the name had amused him or amused Sacchetti perhaps, and that it was basically a steal from a guy that they'd met in the film industry in Italy. I think that probably is the explanation for the name, more than any kind of attempt to patch together the significance of Sigmund Freud's career and the literary significance of the Frankenstein myth.
Well, one of the things that's significant of a Fulci film is the sadistic and drawn-out sequences of violence. Where in a regular film, when someone has their throat cut and blood spurts out, it would last only about a second, but Fulci dwells on it for like what feels like 20-30 seconds, an eternity on screen, and often in extreme close-up.
Well, this is one of his great innovations. It's shocking for what it is, it's shocking for what it shows, it's also shocking for how long it goes on. It keeps cutting, changing angles, and you think, good grief, we're still there, we're still watching this.
I'm thinking of a particular scene in Contraband, also known as The Smuggler, a crime film that is strangely shot more like a horror film in mood and extreme gory violence. And I'm thinking in particular of a scene in that film where a woman has her face slowly burned by a gangster in typical Fulci fare, in an ultra drawn-out sequence. A friend of mine said that today filmmakers could do that scene with better makeup, but they would never ever shoot a scene like that today.
That scene in The Smuggler is absolutely brutal. It may well be that somebody could do it more convincingly with modern special effects, but of course people aren't even using prosthetic special effects anymore. You know? I don't think anyone watches The Smuggler and feels shortchanged in that scene. It's guaranteed to offend and or shock and or amuse, you know, depending on your mileage. But I always found that scene really horrible, really difficult to watch. The peculiarity of it, I think, is as much to do with the fact that he uses a piece of music by Fabio Frizzi over the scene, which has got this kind of insistent, kind of slightly disco, sort of funky disco rhythm. You know, narratively, the point is that you're dealing with a dangerous lunatic and a sadistic, psychopathic character who, when he finds, you know, she's for people who haven't seen the film, it's the scene where a woman passes a consignment of drugs to the head of this drugs cartel. He tests the drugs and finds out that it's cut, and he takes his revenge on the woman for selling him cut drugs by burning her face with a Bunsen burner. You know, a flame. John Waters said something on the subject of this, not on Lucio Fulci, but in general about shocking things in films. And he said, "To be shocked makes me laugh." Part of the appeal of these movies is that when Lucio goes all out to do something really stunningly grotesque, I'm knocked out. I just feel admiration for the sheer, determined, dogged desire to part you with your lunch. In order to understand Lucio, you have to remember he spent virtually the whole of the 1960s as a comedy director. He had some extremely unfortunate experiences in the late 1960s, early 1970s, involving the death of his wife and the death of one of his daughters.
His wife committed suicide because she was diagnosed with cancer. Fulci recalled that he came back from the set and he was greeted by his mother at the door, and he said that that the mother told him that his wife had committed suicide. She had used gas and killed herself. And obviously that was a terrible thing for him and for his two daughters.
I think that left a terribly dark stain on his psyche, and I don't think he was ever quite the same again. So you get this guy who was working professionally as a comedian, as a writer for comedians and a writer of comic scripts, and develops a much more angry sort of artistic persona. Kind of strange, really.
It's not so strange. It's fairly common and well known that many comedians have a very dark or sad past that has made them who they are.
Almost a cliche, but then again, it turns out to be so true so often that I guess it's one of those cliches that there's a reason why it became a cliche. It's because there's so many examples. So true. Yes, I mean the comedian's mask is often often hides a great deal of darkness, doesn't it?
Fulci didn't seem to be an auteur like Dario Argento, writing in a specific genre. He seemed to take a bit of everything that came along.
And the more you look into it, the more you find that a lot of the movies he was making, yes, were essentially producer generated. A producer would have a desire to make this or that movie, and they would get in touch with him because they thought he was the right man for the job. So he wasn't necessarily walking around with a burning desire to make, this film or that film. He was often just taking the best of the suggestions offered to him at any one time. As you know, Italian film was always working on this principle where something would be a hit, and then there would be like a hundred movies on that subject, or 100 movies playing that game for the next 6 months to a year afterwards.
Another of the more crazy Fulci movies is his sword and sorcery picture, Conquest, made in 1983, a time that the big thing was films like Conan the Barbarian, Beastmaster, and Dragon Slayer. And Fulci, always wanting to show off how good a director he was, able to master any genre that was given him, Fulci went straight into it, and Conquest is by far the craziest fantasy movie I've ever seen. In the opening scene, beastmen attack a tribe of peaceful humans in a cave. They crush the heads, revealing brains. They sniff a type of fantasy cocaine and wishbone a young girl, while the evil queen, wearing a golden mask, masturbates with a snake. The film ends with the hero shooting a magical arrow with his bow, splitting the evil queen's golden mask in two, revealing a lipless and eyelidless grotesque face. She screams into the camera as she falls dead to the ground and transforms into a wolf that runs off into the sunset. The end. Now, how many films like this have you seen? Fulci really is one of a kind. Besides all of this, Fulci uses the old trick of smearing Vaseline on the camera lens to create this sort of a dreamy fantasy world feel to the film, but someone just smeared too much Vaseline on the lens, so that, in combination with underlit sets, strong backlight and tons of smoke, sometimes makes it hard to make out what the hell you're watching. But yet, I can't help to love this film. As so many other Fulci films, it's just one-of-a-kind film.
It was a film that he apparently had high hopes for, elevating his career to a different level, which sounds funny because of what it turned out to be like. It was apparently made largely in Mexico, and I know that evidently while he was filming in Mexico, Fulci apparently drank some water there, which he should not have done. And this led to some serious liver problems, which very nearly killed him. He had very bad health after that film. He had other problems, too. He had diabetes, which was the primary health problem. But obviously, the liver problems weren't helping him any. And that would continue to create a lot of problems for him for the rest of his life, too. But I don't think that it was necessarily a terribly unpleasant shoot as such. I just think it's a very strange film, and I think it's deliberately strange. It apparently did have some money behind it, but I don't know if the money all ended up in the movie because it's It's such a strange film. It doesn't really look as though there's really much in the way of sets. It looks like they're using fog a lot and a lot of Vaseline on the lens to kind of keep things very vague and very, very dim and unclear. So if there was a lot of money put into the movie, I don't think it really looks like it on screen. But it's bizarre. It seems almost a movie that's kind of out of step with the times, which makes it very strange to me that it was a movie that apparently he was hopeful would kind of elevate him from making low-budget horror films and maybe making something, bigger films again like he had been making in the 70s. Obviously, it didn't work. It was not successful. And as I said, Fulci's health started to go downhill not long after that, partly because of the illness he contracted while he was making it.
Well, I'm a huge fan of spaghetti westerns, and perhaps the wildest of them all is Fulci's Four of the Apocalypse. Fulci made 3 spaghetti westerns during the Italian western boom: Silver Saddle, which is more like a children's movie, Massacre Time, and Four of the Apocalypse. But according to me, by far the best of them is Four of the Apocalypse. It is so bizarre. In a dark and moody way, I found it unforgettable. I mean, bizarre even by Fulci standards.
If you're a horror fan, and you only see one Lucio Fulci Western, then Fall of the Apocalypse is probably the one to see.
Do you know anything about the Four of the Apocalypse and its background and production?
The original screenplay was apparently not up to Fulci's standards. He did not care for it. He made a point of saying in interviews that he thought it had a very bad script. It was based off of writings of a Western writer named Francis Bret Harte.
A series of short stories, actually, by a writer called Bret Harte, who was a kind of a pulp fiction writer. The film has this episodic quality. It's almost like a road movie, but set in in the Wild West. The characters embark on a journey across country, and the story is governed by each stage of the way they meet a new group of people, and the plot is very episodic in that way. So it doesn't have a narrative that sort of ties itself into any great complexities, but you're on a journey with the characters, and you're encountering more stranger and stranger events.
There are plenty of surreal scenes in Four of the Apocalypse, like brilliant actor Thomas Milan, who plays a bandit that just shows up out of nowhere halfway through the movie and tortures the protagonists. One of the protagonists dies giving birth in a town populated only by men, and the baby is left in a very symbolic way in the strange town with a group of men. In another scene, the heroes are tricked into eating a casserole made of human corpses. The protagonists arrive in a ghost town where one of the heroes, a black guy, a former slave if I remember correctly, he's named Butt, of all names. He reveals that he likes dead people more than the living, and he runs naked into a cemetery in the pouring rain, in a scene that is as beautiful as it's crazy. Everything beautifully shot by Fulci cinematographer Sergio Salvati.
It's difficult to put your finger on quite what's happening with this film, because there are times when it doesn't even feel like a Western anymore. Simultaneously quite gentle and serene, and it's also extremely violent at times as well. So it's a strange cocktail of moods. Pictorially very beautiful. The music can be very laid back and almost blissful, and then the imagery can be absolutely nightmarish and horrific and violent. And so he's always bringing together these flavors that don't necessarily belong together usually. And I think the Fall of the Apocalypse is kind of a dream western. It's generated originally by Giulio Sparigia, who was a producer that Fulci ended up working again on The Black Cat with. I think he offered it to Fulci because he was impressed by how well the White Fang films had done. It was shot back to back with another production. That's the detail I'm trying to remember. And the other production was a Joe D'Amato film, Killers of the Savage North. And the two movies were basically bankrolled together as one. So the same financial deal was kind of cooked up for the two pictures, and they were shot back to back in Austria.
Amazing! I would never have guessed a Western shot in Austria.
I guess they managed to keep the snowy peaks out of sight in the background. But it makes sense when you remember that the Altaville scenes, the scenes in the men-only city, are filmed in a snowbound city.
As far as the production goes, to me, it looks as though there was a fair amount of money put into the movie. It looks excellent. It has great production value. It has a very interesting cast, a very eclectic cast. I think it's definitely one of Fulci's very best films. I'd put it in my top 5 of Fulci's movies. It's one of the strangest Westerns I've ever seen, but in a good way.
Worth noting is the anticlimactic ending of 4 of the Apocalypse, where the hero shoots Thomas Milan's character Chaco while he's sleeping in a very undramatic way, going against virtually every revenge-themed spaghetti western ever made.
Well, it defies expectations because you're led down the path of believing it's going to be the usual kind of Sergio Leone standoff sequence, and it isn't. In some respects, Stubby, the hero played by Fabio Testi, kind of takes the cowardly way out a little bit, doesn't he? Some people would find that anticlimactic. I think it works. I think it works because it's established that Chaco is so vile and so evil. He's basically Charles Manson of the Old West. He's even made up to look a bit like Charles Manson. But I think Tomas Milian, who's absolutely brilliant in the film, was one of the actors that Fulci really truly respected. And as a matter of fact, he starred in arguably his 3 best films.
Why do you think Fulci liked Milan?
Well, Tomas Milian was indeed a serious actor. He took his work seriously. It didn't matter whether he was doing a film for Visconti or he was making some silly Poliziotesco film for Umberto Lenzi. He took it all seriously. He was very inventive. He had a wicked sense of humor, which I'm sure appealed to Fulci very much. I think he was one of those guys that probably fought back. If Fulci ever tried to push him, I'm sure Tomas Milian had no difficulty pushing him right back. And they liked each other. Milian felt that Fulci was a better filmmaker than any of his movies ever let on. He said that he felt that Fulci was a little too indifferent about the end result, that he was more interested in just getting the paycheck and just sort of doing the movie in a half-assed manner. I don't agree with him, but that's what he felt. He felt that Fulci had talent that went beyond anything that he ever directed.
Some say Fulci didn't like westerns, certainly not in the way John Ford or Sergio Leone did. His westerns have a nasty, depressive edge, gritty, ugly landscapes, and where there aren't even any likable anti-heroes.
He regarded himself as a journeyman filmmaker, which is to say, whatever came his way, he would make it. He was a cinema fan. He loved John Ford. He loved Howard Hawks. He loved the classic westerns, and I think he understood what made them work. And I think he just had that kind of bizarre outlook that he knew how to bring something new into it that you wouldn't necessarily expect in a western. So I think his first 2 westerns in particular have a nasty edge to them that you don't necessarily associate with westerns necessarily. Massacre Time was his first kind of quote-unquote violent movie. It's his first movie with really any kind of gore content. I mean, it's pretty sedate compared to the movies he made later on, but it does have a sadistic streak. You have a villain in it who clearly gets off on the violence. There's this scene in the movie, I think it's at the beginning, where he sets his dogs loose and on this man who has displeased him, and the dogs catch up to the guy and tear his throat out, and Fulci zooms in on his mouth as he's kind of licking his lips over this. And it's that kind of fascination with seeing flesh being torn apart that just, that sets it up right there. What's going to happen, explode later on in the 70s with the violent horror movies he ended up making. So the westerns in a way kind of bridge the gap between the early comedies and musicals that he directed, then going towards the thrillers and then into the horror films.
The film Lizard in a Woman's Skin is a film that is rarely discussed, probably because it's not a horror film, but a giallo. But then again, not really a giallo. It's weird, surrealistic imagery. It has special effects by Carlo Rambaldi, who later built the first Alien together with H.R. Giger, and later Possession and Dune. Maybe most famous for creating E.T. in Spielberg's film. Rambaldi created vivisected dogs for Fulci's film that were so realistic that Fulci was brought to trial for animal abuse, and it was only after Rambaldi demonstrated the puppets in court that the charges were dropped. Do you have anything to say about this particular film?
The one that I find just keeps getting better and better when I go back to it is Lizard in a Woman's Skin. I think it's one of his most interesting stories. It's one of the most complex narratives that he ever worked with. Beautifully acted, and it's got one of the very best film scores. I think the Morricone's score for Lizard in a Woman's Skin is not just one of Fulci's best scores, but it's one of Morricone's best scores. I think it's just absolutely staggeringly good. I like the sense of a film that's based around a duplicitous character that is the film's playing the same game as the character, trying constantly to throw you off the scent and to make what you think you know and what seems self-evident something that you have to doubt. And and that's something that the Giallo movies like to do, is to throw doubt on everything and everyone. But I think of all the Giallo movies made in Italy in the 70s, I think Lizard is probably the most sophisticated and the most slippery in the way that it uses various techniques to try and dissuade you from believing what you think you know.
Who wrote the script?
He wrote it in collaboration with his usual collaborator at the time, Roberto Gianviti. Fulci was, as I've mentioned, was a very accomplished screenwriter in his own right, and at that time the Giallo films were popular because of Dario Argento. The Giallo film had really kind of been born in the 60s with Mario Bava, but his films weren't terribly popular with the public, so it wasn't until Bird of the Crystal Plumage came out in 1970 that these movies started to really take off. Fulci had actually made his own first thriller before that. He'd made Perversion Story back in 1969, and he co-wrote a thriller that Ricardo Freda directed called Double Face with Klaus Kinski that same year. So he had some experience with thrillers already, but basically at that point, the producer Edmondo Amati was looking for movies like Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and he knew Fulci, and Fulci was at a bad time in his life. It was after the suicide of his wife, and he was, I'm sure, having problems being all of a sudden single dad, raising two daughters on his own, and so these were classy films at this point. I mean, these weren't the movies he ended up doing in the 90s. These movies actually had budgets and money. You had international name actors in Lizard in a Woman's Skin like Stanley Baker and Leo Genn, for example. These were very distinguished actors to be in movies like this. So there was a lot of money put into that movie. It ended up doing extremely well at the box office. It was an extremely successful film.
Then we come to a film that I don't really like, but it has to be presented here because it really is one of the most famous or infamous Fulci films. A film that to this day is banned in many countries and still cut by 3 minutes in the UK due to the film's graphic sexual violence. Most Giallo films have an evil whispering killer, but in this film the killer, the Ripper so to speak, imitates Donald Duck when he stabs his victims. The film opens really great though, with a man throwing a stick to his dog and the dog comes back with a severed hand in its mouth and the screen freeze frames on it to the opening titles with disco music. This was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that in a film. I asked Troy Howarth what he thought of the New York Ripper.
I love the New York Ripper. I understand why it's controversial. I understand why many people despise it. I hated it the first time I saw it myself. I found it incredibly offensive the first time I watched it. The first time I watched it, I had the same reaction I think a lot of people do, and which was just basically, this guy's getting off on seeing these women being mutilated. This is disgusting. And it really bothered me. And this was back in the days of VHS, so I took the tape out of the VCR and I almost wanted to throw it down the toilet. I thought, this movie is disgusting. But what was interesting was, over the next several days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I realized, well, there has to be something more to this than just the vile kind of quality of it. Although, yes, the movie is extremely brutal, and it does definitely dwell on scenes of women being mutilated, I wouldn't describe it as being a misogynistic movie. I think it's flat out misanthropic for the most part. There's really, you have this lead character who is incredibly hypocritical, and I think a lot of people watch that and think that he's supposed to be Fulci's mouthpiece, but he isn't. He's the guy who basically allows this prostitute that he's sleeping with get killed over the phone because he doesn't want to let on that he knows where she lives. He goes in and he lectures about morality to these people while he's on the side. He's a policeman having sex with a prostitute. He's not meant to be your sort of moral point of focus. There's a great sequence in the movie where Alexander Delacolle plays this very affluent, very wealthy nymphomaniac who likes to go out and hook up with different men. The argument that the movie was suggesting that she deserves what she got, if I felt like it was suggesting that, but I don't think it really does. I think there's a great suspense sequence where you really want to see her get away. She's tied up in the bed with the guy that she thinks is the Ripper sleeping next to her. She manages to get herself free. She manages to escape. And you're pulling for her. You want to see her escape. You don't want to see her get killed. So I think that the idea that Fulci is suggesting that all these people, all these women that are getting sliced up, deserve what's happening to them, I think that's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction. I think the movie is much more complex than that. And you also have a killer who has this incredibly twisted pathology, but there's a very heartbreaking final scene that comes out of that, where basically he has this little girl who's dying in the hospital, and the movie ends with the killer is dead, and we see the little girl in the hospital trying to get a hold of her father on the phone, and she's crying. Why doesn't Dad want to talk to me? It's a heartbreaking ending. I don't think it's an easy movie to love. I think it's intentional. I think it's a bit like Fulci himself. I think it's a tough bastard of a movie.
Let's talk about Manhattan Baby. I guess this is the film that started the downfall, even though it's considered by some to be part of the Fulci horror canon. Shot right after the New York Ripper, Manhattan Baby, a film combining inspiration and scenes from The Exorcist, Poltergeist, but perhaps interestingly, it is said to have inspired Clive Barker when he made Hellraiser a few years after, with the evil amulet trading hands. Do you have anything to say about it?
It was an unhappy experience for everybody involved, from what I can tell. It was, I think, intended to be something different than what it turned out to be. I know that the Egyptian sequences were apparently imposed on the movie later on. I'm surprised by that personally, because for my money, the Egyptian scenes are probably the best scenes in the movie. The big problem I have with the movie personally is I just don't think the lead actors are very interesting. You could totally see somebody like a Tomas Milian or a John Saxon or Christopher George or David Warbeck, somebody like that playing the lead role, and it would have been so much more interesting. Christopher Connolly, to me, is extremely flat, and I don't find him to be a very good lead. It's a strange film. It's extremely sluggish. It seems to lack energy, but yet it has sequences of great effectiveness, just in terms of, not necessarily in terms of what happens, but in terms of how they're filmed, the framing and so forth. I think the ending is wonderfully weird. It's a fairly well shot and edited sequence, and the effects might be a little bit crude, but hey, it's okay because it has that anything goes attitude that I really do like about these movies.
I know that you like The Devil's Honey. It's the same lead actress as in Dario Argento's opera, right?
They were actually sisters. In the Fulci film, it was Bianca Marsalich, and in Argento's film, it was Christina, who was her sister. And as a matter of fact, they were both together in a film that Fulci wrote, that he did not direct. He was going to direct it, but he was ill, so it was directed by somebody else. It was a movie called The Trap.
Was it any good?
Yeah, it's good. It has Florinda Balkan is back from the 70s era Fulci film, and another Dario Argento connection would be Tony Musante from Bird with the Crystal Plumage. He's in it as well. So it's kind of like The Devil's Honey in a way.
Haven't seen it, but you like it.
I think it's a great character piece. He once described it as being a movie about the loneliness of sadomasochism. And if you watch the film, you'll see what he means by that these are basically very unhappy people who are very isolated, and they're just looking for some kind of a connection. And there's a very bittersweet kind of quality to it. Fulci didn't really get a lot of opportunities after a certain point to make movies about relationships because he was making movies about exploding heads. So here was a chance for him to make something. It's not exactly a love story, but it's kind of one, with very flawed people who are just sort of thrown together once again by fate. And, it doesn't turn out well. It's a tragic film. In some respects, I think it is his last really, truly good film. Again, he came to that movie after an extensive illness. You can see him in the film. He plays a vendor who sells the lead actress a charm bracelet, and he looks very gaunt in it, as opposed to, he was normally rather a husky man, but in that film he looks extremely thin.
Did you do an interview with the actress about it?
No, as a matter of fact, I don't know that she's ever been interviewed by anybody. If she has been, I don't know what she would have to say, because I did speak with Brett Halsey, and he did not have good things to say about her. Apparently Fulci did not like her at all. So I'd be interested to hear her side of the story, but she was not well liked.
Why was that? Was it because she had diva manners?
A little bit, but also apparently, and this is just what they said, she was involved with drugs, and Fulci despised drug addicts. He hated drugs with a passion, and Brett Halsey had to do some fairly intimate sequences with her, and he was just very uncomfortable with her because, let's just say, he thought she might have been a little bit on the loose side, and he was not comfortable with certain things with her. But he liked the movie, he liked the part, he liked working with Fulci, but he did not like her at all.
The release of Zombie Flesh Eaters, according to Fulci had expected Zombie Flesh Eaters to be a huge success, and he said to his collaborators, "Just wait, the phone will start ringing very soon." And of course, the phone never started ringing, and Fulci was so disappointed because the film made so much money overseas. So almost 10 years later, Fulci was in need of money, and the opportunity to direct a sequel to his film presented itself.
Zombie 3, the story of Zombie 3 is much more interesting than the film itself. I interviewed the lead actress in that film, Beatrice Ring, who was the most incredibly sweet woman I spoke with. She is such an incredibly positive, just big-hearted woman, very, very kind. And she hated Fulci. And she kept apologizing because she's not a negative person, but yet he made her life absolutely miserable, and she despised him for it. So she was the one person I interviewed who really said a lot about Fulci that was very negative. But basically, Fulci at that point, he was as ill as he ever was. He was in a position where he was desperate for money. They had been talking about doing a Zombie 3 earlier, which was going to be a 3D film. But then some of the 3D films that came out around that time weren't terribly profitable, so they decided to shelve that idea. Then this other group of people involving Claudio Fragasso and Bruno Mattei and all those different people came up with the idea of doing a Zombie 3 in the Philippines. So Fulci, who is in very bad health, goes to the Philippines with his daughter Camilla to assist him, and the temperature and the humidity and everything, it was miserable down there. With his liver problem, he was retaining fluid in his stomach. He was very, very gaunt. I have a picture in my book you can see of him. Looks like he's actually wearing pajamas on the set. He's gaunt. He looks horrible. He looks like he's ready to drop dead any moment, but he has this huge belly. And it wasn't because he was fat, it was because of the fluid. So he would be able to work up to a certain point during the day, but then he would have to go, and he'd literally have to have his stomach drained of all this fluid that was being retained. So he obviously was not in a good mood. He was not happy. He probably was worse than usual, which is probably why Beatrice Ring had such a bad experience with him. He did the best job that he could under the circumstances. The script was terrible. The actors he was working with, for the most part, weren't very good. The crew wasn't very good. The circumstances just weren't positive in any way. So his version of the story is he turned in a cut that ran about 75 minutes. Other people said that his version ran not even an hour. So basically, they realized it was too short, and they had to add in some footage. So At this point, Fulci said, I'm not going back to the Philippines. I'm done. I don't want anything else to do with this movie. So Bruno Mattei was brought in, and Bruno Mattei filmed all of these sequences. Anything that you see in the film that does not involve the lead actors like Beatrice Ring and Darren Sarafian and so forth, all those scenes, like with the people in the hazmat suits, all that stuff was filmed by Bruno Mattei. I think roughly it's about a 50-50 split, that some of it, half the movie is Fulci's and the other half is Bruno Mattei. And I would say that the Bruno Mattei material is probably some of the better material that maybe he ever directed, because I'm not a fan of Bruno Mattei's movies in general. But the stuff that Fulci made, obviously, you don't want to just make excuses for the man, but he really was in a bad way at the time, and I don't think that anybody could have really made much out of that film. It's pretty bad.
Sweet House of Horrors is another insane film. I can't even begin to describe it, but in the end of the film, the two dead parents of the little children enter two small stones in a way of staying with them forever as they go. The children finally walk out of the house, where the evil spiritualist sees them hiding something in their pockets and tries to confiscate the stones. But when he picks up one of the stones, his right hand is melted and he screams in agony. And the little children are seen laughing crazily into the camera at the end in a freeze frame.
My initial reaction to the Sweet House of Horrors was not good at all. I didn't I didn't like it at all the first time I saw it. I have to admit, it grew on me a little bit when I watched it a couple more times. I kind of appreciated it a little bit more. It's a weird movie because it's, in a way, it's almost like it's a children's movie, but yet it's clearly much too brutal to be a children's movie. I don't know if anybody quite could make up their mind what it was supposed to be.
The House of Clocks is another made-for-television film that impressed me with its insane script. Apart from the violence that seems more forced and exploited than ever, the surreal elements are at work again. I'm not sure, but in one scene, a group of stoner kids try to rob and murder the inhabitants of the house, only to be killed themselves and then waking up in the car. I read somewhere that it was implied that they had been a massive hallucination from smoking weed in the car and then just waking up there again, and the whole thing had been just a dream. But others say that it's the House of Clocks turning back the time. I don't know, I've just watched the movie once.
I actually like The House of Clocks. I think that's one of the better later Fulci films. I think it's in some respects, it's kind of an elegant little movie. It was, as you said, it was made for TV. It's extremely violent for TV. As a matter of fact, it was never shown on TV for that reason. As you may recall, there's some extremely gory sequences in it. So I think the idea that Fulci was playing around with a lot was basically the inevitability of fate, that you cannot escape your fate. Time isn't what it used to be. And basically, these characters are probably going to keep reliving this over and over again. It's kind of a purgatory, paying for their sins idea. That's how I kind of took it.
In an interview in the middle of Demonia, Fulci, when asked about that fans want a proper remake of zombie and more good films like the one he made 10 years ago, Fulci said that he just made 2 good films for television, one called Sweet House of Horrors and House of Clocks.
Zombie Part 2, Part 3.
No,
not
Part 3,
my film.
So
it's not my film.
Yeah.
This is my film. I shoot for TV for Dania Film in Italy. But the name is the House and the Time, and the other, the Sweet House of Horror, the Sweet Horror's House. It is two good films for TV.
So, apparently Fulci was pleased with these films, something I find rather strange.
Lucio's fortunes were tied very much to the fortunes of the Italian industry as a whole. And in around 1983-84, the bottom fell out of the Italian film industry. American studio pictures started to play the exploitation game themselves. And of course, if Steven Spielberg wants to make an exploitation movie, he can make it on, $40, $50, $80 million. The audiences then become accustomed to seeing, if a Nazi's face is going to melt and they in Raiders of the Lost Ark, then that sets the standard for how melting Nazis are meant to look in other people's movies as well, And so, given that the Italian exploitation industry couldn't really keep up with that level of financing, the international sales started to go down, and then really television was the last gig in town eventually in the early 90s. I mean, I think maybe Joe D'Amato and Lucio were just about the last people working.
A Cat in the Brain, Nightmare Concert, använde klipp från Touch of Death, en annan Fulci-film som gjorde några år tidigare. Touch handlar om en solovårare som förför och slaktar rika kvinnor för att sedan steka och äta deras kött. Slaktavfallet maler han ner och matar sina grisar med skiten i svinstigen. Touch använder en unken buskis. Det finns hur många scener som helst, med till exempel en där mördaren inte kan stänga bakluckan med liket för att benen sticker ut och fastnar.
Brad Halsey is an American actor. When Fulci he offered him Touch of Death, he read the script and he said, you know, I think this would be much more interesting if we added some comedy to it. So he and Fulci worked on adding in that kind of element of dark comedy to the film. So it's kind of like a splatter version of Charlie Chaplin's Monsieur Verdot or something like that, where you have this literal lady killer going around and killing off these women for their money. It's very over the top and it has a very sardonic sense of humor. And Halsey said that was not how it was originally written, but Fulci was agreeable to transforming it into that.
I Nightmare Concert återanvänds klippen från Touch of Death som en film i filmen som Fulci själv då, som spelar sig själv i filmen som regisserar. Fulci driver här med fördomen att skräckfilmsregissörer är sinnessjuka och eller blir drivna till sinnessjukdom genom sitt yrke. Något som han själv blev anklagad för hela sin skräckfilmskarriär. Vi ser här Fulci gå på restaurang bara för att drabbas av hallucinationer av kannibalens måltid i Touch of Death. Illamående flyr han ut. Vi ser honom skriva manus till sin nya film och kameran zoomar in mot hans huvud och inuti hans huvud där en galen rabiessmittad katt klöser sönder hans hjärna. Ni fattar grejen.
I think the idea of Cat in the Brain was a good one. I think if he would have had time and money, he could have made a better film out of it. I think if he would have had the freedom to sort of reach back into his filmography and pull out the real jewels from the really good movies, he would have done. But he was making it for the same company that made those movies, and he was obliged to use those clips. And it wasn't even just clips from his own movies. He had to use clips from these other films that he quote-unquote presented. There was a series of films called Lucio Fulci Presents that he had something to do with a couple of them. I know Hansel and Gretel, for example, he actually did direct a couple of sequences without credit, but for the most part, he was just being paid to put his name on the titles, in the same way that you'll see, like, you know, John Carpenter presents this or Wes Craven presents that. They don't do anything. They're just getting paid for their name. He didn't even intend to play the lead role himself, as a matter of fact. He always insisted that he had an actor lined up to play the part. And a day or two before filming, they dropped out and he couldn't find anybody else. So he just said, well, I'll go ahead and do it. Because he had been acting even going back as far as the 50s. He had played little roles in various films directed by other people. So he felt comfortable being in front of the camera. He wasn't, I don't think anybody would argue he was the greatest actor in the world, but I think if the movie has appeal, it's largely because it's so much of just Lucio Fulci on camera, and there's something kind of precious about that. I think it's fun for what it is. I mean, it's one of those movies, it's incredibly crude. It's extremely rough around the edges. There's this kind of very handcrafted, thrown together kind of feel. You kind of feel like you're watching you're looking at a painting that hasn't quite dried yet.
Fulci skulle sen komma att regissera 2 filmer till, Voices from Beyond och Door to Silence.
These last 2 films, it's very interesting. They're very, very preoccupied with death, and a lot of Fulci films are, but given their proximity to being at the end of his career and the end of his life, it's interesting to see a man who's just basically having a dialogue with death. And it's kind of dealing with the idea, is there something beyond what we're dealing with here on Earth? Is there another plane of existence? Is there another form of consciousness? Do we just rot in a box when we're dead? Or is there something beyond that? I think there's something a little bit poignant about that when you realize the kind of shape he was in when he was making these movies. He was very ill. And he didn't realize he was going to die as young as he did. And he was only 68 when he passed away. But his health problems certainly made him look older than that. So I think Voices from Beyond is, in its own way, I think it's a very worthy, well-crafted little movie. It even has a little dream sequence with zombies. So Fulci's last zombie movie in a sense. Door to Silence is a movie that most people seem to despise, but I kind of like it. I would describe it as being like a Twilight Zone episode that's been admittedly overstretched to an hour and a half. It is a lot of John Savage driving around in a car sweating, which doesn't sound very exciting, I know, but I think it's interesting in the sense of how it plays around with time. You were talking before about the House of Clocks and its relationship with time. And here's a movie where, again, time is almost sort of standing still, and it's a sense of a life that is kind of in limbo in between one world and the next. And that's probably not the most cinematic of concepts, I admit, but I find it kind of interesting. And I, for whatever reason, I just find it to be one of those movies that I don't want to use the word comforting, but it's just kind of, it's not an unpleasant movie to watch. It doesn't offend me in the sense that it seems sloppy or it seems inept or it seems half-hearted. Only two of Fulci's movies really irritate me to the extent that I could never really see wanting to watch them again. And those are The Ghosts of Sodom and Demonia.
Why do you hate Demonia? I just remember it having absolutely fantastic sets and mood in the monastery and crypt scenes.
They actually filmed in real crypts in Sicily. And Brett Halsey, when I talked with him, talked about how there was a lot of superstition, and there was a lot of people who were very upset about them. They were filming in there, and there were real skeletons, and this was the real deal. So they kind of lucked into that aspect of it. There really wasn't much money on the film, and that becomes very apparent when you watch it, especially anytime there's any kind of gore sequences involved, where you can see he's got the idea for a really, really good, spectacular, nasty sequence, but it's executed so poorly. There's a sequence where a guy is drawn and quartered, for example. His legs are tied to a tree, and it's so botched in the way it's executed. It's such a shame, because it's the kind of thing that back when he was working with that crew in the 80s with people like Gennaro De Rossi and so forth, he could have created an amazingly beautiful but horrific sequence. And here it's just like, this is so sloppily put together. And really, according to what Brett Halsey told me, they ran out of money and the movie was basically really never finished. So what you're seeing is admittedly unfinished, and they're just trying to sort of glue it together and hoping that it holds together, but it doesn't quite do so.
Of course, there could be said a lot more of Fulci and his films. Certainly about Fulci's own favorite film, Beatrice Cenci. But unfortunately, the show is now almost 75 minutes long, the longest show so far. Finally, the tragic last years of Fulci's life was a struggle to get the film The Wax Mask made, with Dario Argento as a producer. It was a slow process, and Fulci died before the film had full financing, and the film was later directed by special effects specialist Sergio Stevaletti. And although it's not much of a Fulci film, there is one sequence that showcases Fulci's beloved flesh-eating pigs having fun. As I've said before, Fulci was a one-of-a-kind filmmaker with a unique way of thinking, and even though some world-class professional directors made films for television today that are consciously cruel and provocative, the films Fulci made were unfiltered and honestly made with a savage cruelty and rage straight from the heart of the man himself. He is now a part of a small club of dead, likable bad guys from another time whose behavior would never ever be tolerated today. Ja, och med de här orden avslutar vi det här avsnittet. Jag heter Henrik Möller, musiken är skriven av Testbild. Hej då.